So, oh yeah, we're recording. Great. So we're happy to have Oleksiy here today talking about stockouts and inflation. Oleksiy, we go for an hour. House rules are if you people have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in and ask your question just like you would during a regular seminar. Okay. And then we'll have time at the end. We'll leave the stream open for more questions and further discussion. So go ahead, Oleksiy, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much for having us. This is a joint work with Alberto Cavallo. He may be able to jump on the call and answer questions. If not, I'm happy to answer them. And the views here are not necessarily the views of the Bank of Canada. So our main motivation is something that's very hotly debated today in academia and in the policy circles, which is the behavioral inflation since the beginning of the pandemic. Here you can see the plot with the time series for CPI inflation rates, 12-month rates for 7 countries that will be in our data set. So US, Canada, and others, including China as well. Now, the typical pattern, so pattern is very similar across these countries. Shortly after the pandemic started by sometime in mid-spring in 2020, inflation was at the sort of lowest point, and then ever since then it's been going up. And the plots stopped in May, but we know that even until today, through October, November, the inflation rates have been rising and staying high. For example, in the US in September, consumer price inflation clocked at above 4%, annualized. So part of the debate is about whether this high inflation is going to stay, or is it going to go back to quote unquote normal before the pandemic started. Part of the discussion of what kind of mechanisms may have been contributing to this behavior inflation has to do with so-called supply disruptions that generally affect the costs in the wholesale retail sector, and therefore may be pushing prices up. So the work today is motivated by these discussions, and hopefully will present some evidence that will be helpful. Here's the quick summary of the paper today. So what we do is we analyze micro data to construct 2 high-frequency measures of shortages in consumer product markets in these 7 countries. The 2 frequency measures reflect temporary stockouts as well as sort of more permanent unavailability of products. So they reflect the number of discontinued products in consumer markets. The analysis consists of 3 parts. In the first part, we're going to show you how these measures of shortages moved since the beginning of the pandemic. We document several patterns there. One is when the pandemic started, so by around spring, there was a sharp, pretty remarkable rise in shortages in nearly all sectors. But over time, the composition of shortages evolved. First, there was a different dynamic between temporary stockouts and discontinued products. Temporary stockouts have been declining since the initial rise, whereas discontinued products have been persistently sort of gradually going up. So that's the first compositional change. And the second change is that the composition of shortages across products have evolved as well. For some products, shortages have returned back to around normal levels, whereas for other sectors, shortages remain high or have been increasing. In the second part of the analysis, we try to find connection between these dynamics of stockouts with inflationary effects. So we'll show you sort of very basic analysis that associates stockouts with inflation. And that's sort of very kind of first tier attempt at establishing the link. And then in the third part of the analysis, we go a little bit deeper, where we develop a model that predicts a relationship between the costs facing retail firms and their prices and their decisions for how much inventory to hold, and therefore how frequently they will stock out. So this model will predict a joint relationship between prices in stockouts, which we observe in the data, and the underlying behavior of the cost, which may be affected by things like supply chain disruption. Okay, so that's the plan of the analysis. Let me go into sort of the data right away. We're going to use microdata for individual products from the Billion Prices project. If you don't know, this is the project that was founded by Roberto Rigobon and my co-author Alberto Cavallo, which currently is owned and collected by private firm Price Stats. So the Billion Prices project assembles Microprice data that is collected by programs, by automatic bots, which scrape information for products, mainly prices, but also other information from online of large multi-product retailers. Now, these are not only online sellers. There's no Amazon in our data set. These are sort of large sellers, often international, that offer products both online as well as in brick and mortar stores. The scraping procedure, just to quickly tell you how it works, is, so as you all know, when you shop online, there's a website for the retailer from whom you want to buy a product. Now, this program, the bot goes in the source page for the website and finds information on the price of the product, for example. So it would see that, you know, this type of milk is offered at the price of $1.199. And so it takes this information and puts it in a nice data set that we can analyze. Okay, so that's how the web scraping works. A quick summary of the coverage in our data set. So in the data set, we have 70 large retailers from 7 countries. 7 countries are listed here. So these are Canada, China, France, Germany, Japan, Spain, and the United States. You can see that there's a lot of individual products. So this is very detailed data. Number of retailers is not that big, so that's just to say that, you know, these are very, very large retailers. Let me say a couple of words about coverage of products. First of all, we don't cover all sectors for goods, but we cover most of them. So in terms of coverage of goods, it would cover 65% of the CPI weight for goods, okay, and about a third of the total CPI weight. The sectors that are included in the data set are food and beverages, household products, health products, electronics, consumer durables, and other goods, which are mainly personal care goods. Not included here are alcohol and tobacco and apparel, which are in the Billion Prices data, but we did not include them because of, you know, certain sort of issues with the quality of the data on product availability there. The other products that are not in our data and not in the source data either are cars and gasoline. Unfortunately, but it is how it is. But of course, we know that a lot of examples of inflationary pressures today use cars and gasoline as an example. So this is not part of the data. Okay, so let me tell you how we measure shortages. The data are daily. We will, in the analysis, we will aggregate them to weekly frequency to not deal with a lot of kind of noise in the daily data. But anyway, T here denotes the date. There's going to be a sector J, and we have detail for sectors at the 3-digit level, which is going to be 34 3-digit sectors. And we have 7 countries, index C. So imagine you go online and you look for a product, right? Multi-purpose citrus wipes here, right? And sometimes you may see, so usually you would see that it's available. There's going to be a price information for it. But sometimes when it's not available, the seller will advertise it as such. It would say something like, sorry, this product is currently unavailable. So we construct the rate of temporary stockouts, as we call them, as the share of all observations on a given date, which have this kind of advertisement, right? So number of out of stock advertised as such over all number of products available on the website. So these are temporary stockouts. But sometimes the product suddenly is removed from the website altogether. So its offer on the marketplace is discontinued. And we would like to use that as a alternative measure of a stockout, if you want. We call it permanent stockouts. And the way we measure it is we look at the share of products that stop being on the website relative to a certain date in the past. So our benchmark date is beginning of the pandemic, which is January 2020. And so the share of permanent stockouts would tell you what's the fraction of all products that were on the website in January 2020 that was lost since then till today, day T. Okay, so that's going to be our share, our measure of permanent stockouts. And you will see that it's very important to make distinction between both because they move very differently and may imply different explanations for what's going on today in the data. We sometimes use both together, so we call them all stockouts when we sum both temporary stockouts and permanent stockouts. Okay, so this is how we measure shortages in retail.
Oleksiy, is it clear that everybody's website follows a standard rule about when to call it temporary and when to just exit out? It seemed like it might be kind of arbitrary just how they happen to define, how they happen to program the website or something.
It is absolutely a very fair question. It is arbitrary, is sort of to assume that this is what's happening and it's happening similarly in all websites. We don't know. I'll give you one example when it's actually sort of distinction is not that kind of black and white. One is it could be that when the seller is not able to offer the product right away, but the seller doesn't know what's going to happen with that availability in the future, it might initially indicate that the product is temporarily out of stock, and then later, perhaps with more information about availability, it would convert the temporary stock out to a permanent by just removing, the advertisement of the product from the website. So that's just one example when the distinction is not that clear cut. We just wanted to use these two definitions to try to use this information when retailers do go through the pain and say, okay, so the banner is still there, but we just tell you that right now it's unavailable. For whatever reason they do that, versus when they decide to not do that or do that later and remove the banner altogether. We just want to keep track of that distinction on the website because it could be relevant. And in any case, you will see that actually these two measures behave very differently in the data. So that's why we use them interchangeably. We look at two of them separately, but we also look at the sum of the two as kind of holistic measure of issues with making products available online. So let me show you sort of first sets of pictures of how these measures look like in the data. So here's and we're going to use the United States half of the time here just because data are kind of more detailed, more reliable. And I have some evidence for other countries, but it's just useful to kind of fix ideas for how things look like because they look quite similar for other countries as well. So this is the all stockouts, so both temporary and permanent, for the US as a whole, starting in 2019. So we start a year prior to the pandemic. And we do that so that you can see the difference in magnitudes in prevalence of these events once the pandemic has started and have been going since then. You can see that the share of unavailable products, which was around between 10 and 15% prior to the pandemic, so think of it as a normal level, right after the pandemic in mid-spring of 2020 went all the way up to 35. So this is a multifold increase in availability of products online. Now, the initial spike was very remarkable, perhaps of a combination of forces that have been going on early in the pandemic. But even since then, you can say that the level has decreased of all shortages, but it nonetheless stayed, was at least double than has been before the pandemic. If you split between these temporary and permanent stockouts, what you can see is they behave also very differently. These are slightly different measures, but still it's useful to look at how different they are. So temporary stockouts, when the supplier says, okay, banner is still here, but right now it's not available. They went up, but ever since then they've been normalizing and kind of reached the pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2020. Very opposite picture for the discontinued product. These are net discontinued product, right? We don't distinguish entry, exit. It's more like on net. If you compare it to pre-pandemic levels, which by definition was about 0. Once you go into the pandemic, then you can see that the net mass of discontinued products jumped high, but also has been kind of steadily rising over the time of the pandemic.
Sorry, Oleksiy.
Yes.
Quick question. Sorry, when you define permanent, is it that they remove it from the website and it doesn't show up again ever, or is it just that they remove it or it can come back?
So you see that. Yes. So thank you. This will help me to clarify here. So the way we define it, we just look at all products on the website, and we just look at how that number, total products, where it is relative to the number of all products before the pandemic hit. So we don't track if this individual product is removed, whether it's never coming back or not. We haven't done that. This would be a more accurate measure if you want to think of stockouts that really long, really persist. But on the other hand, this is a very simple measure because we don't need to think about things like entry of products, exit of products, how they co-move together. It's very simple just because it tells you that in terms of total number of varieties of products offered online of consumers' products, that relative to before the pandemic, the number of varieties have been a lot lower, and number of discontinued products has been even rising. So this indicates that on net, the number of product lines that are being maintained and used to supply individual consumer products online have been declining. So that's
I don't think this is very plausible, but how do you know there weren't lots of new products coming along? I mean, I agree that seems implausible, but you don't really know that, right? By this measure.
We're not saying there's that could have been, right? But if there have been, for example, I don't know if it's true or not, more new products, this evidence indicates that there have been even more disappearing products at the same time. So we're focusing on sort of on net when you add them all up.
Right. But you said something about less variety. We don't really know that, right? Because that would.
So by less variety, I mean the number of varieties at the point of time relative to number of varieties before everything hit. So that statement is still true here, because even though you can have more new varieties, when you compare that to number of varieties that disappeared, this statistic tells you that on net, when you add them all up, there's less varieties today than before the pandemic.
Oleksiy,
okay, just to give you,
there's no sort of like weighting of importance of these different varieties. So really, this is very consistent with the story where firms started to just focus on their core toilet paper as opposed to the one that like the scented one or something like that. Because you can actually see like at the end of the period, kind of the core ones don't even stock out as much as they did beforehand. So it seems they're really kind of changing how they're stocking one set of products versus other sets of products, right?
Right. So this is one of our examples of what can be going on. You said it exactly right. If a multi-product, so if a retailer is offering a number of products and then suddenly, there's some kind of issues that incentivizes this retailer to kind of make a decision which of the brands to continue to offer versus not. So naturally, they might want to remove less popular brands from the marketplace while focusing on the brands that they know sell. So this is a very, very reasonable example. We don't have direct information, I don't think, about sort of weights within narrow category of the good, which of the brands are more or less popular. I'll let Alberto correct me, but yeah, we don't have, for example, quantities, or revenues associated with each brand versus its close substitute. But this is kind of one example of how to interpret this fact here. Certainly, there's been a lot of anecdotes out there saying this example in particular. Okay, so this was the US. Let me show you that things are not very different for other countries. So US is still kind of bold blue here, and we're adding the 6 other countries, including China. You can tell China here by seeing the line that spiked earlier, because China was hit by the crisis earlier than others. So similarities are for temporary stockout, all countries hit very sort of high level when the pandemic started. And again, you can see the distinction between China and others. So that's very similar. Another similarity is that temporary stockouts have been going down pretty much everywhere. Okay. Quite different for permanent stockouts, where again, like in the US, the number of discontinued products have been going up steadily for some countries, but not necessarily for others. So examples of countries where discontinued products continue to rise, where other than US, are Canada and Germany. Okay, and I'll show you later if you tuned into inflation numbers from other countries, you would know that in Canada and Germany in particular, inflation has been high. Example on the other end is Japan, where there hasn't been such a big rise in discontinued product, and we know that inflation is not has been high in Japan relative to these other countries. Now, going into a different dimension of the data, so looking across sectors, just to give you a little bit of detail there. Again, it's very useful just because you will see there's a lot of variation across different sectors in terms of behavior of stockouts. So here, these are sectors in the United States, and we distinguish these are like 1-digit sectors. Again, food and beverage, electronics, and others. So these are, I believe these are all stockouts. Now, the sectors that are high in terms of shortages here are food and beverages, right? It kind of was hit really badly at the beginning, but even still today, even still high. So quite persistent behavior of shortages in food and beverages. And the other example is electronics and also household products, where there's a lot of durables, right? But electronics in particular. On the other hand, sectors where shortages have dissipated are health products and other goods, that is personal care products. Okay, so very different behavior, and the hope was that this variation in behavior of shortages across sectors and countries is a useful source of variation to try to establish association with inflation based on a very short historical data sample. Just to give just a few numbers, I'm not going to stay long here. This is just a list of 2-digit product categories, a little bit more detailed than on the previous graph, where second column here is sort of the worst that it's been over 2021 in terms of shortages. And the last column is where all stockouts ended up by, I think it's May of 2021. Okay, so several things you can see here. As I said, common thing is that the worst for all sectors was achieved early on, so in spring of 2020, and it's been coming down since for many sectors. The differences are, so large differences across sectors later on in the pandemic. So some sectors stayed high, like food and consumer durables, And I'm sort of outlining here some of these products. You see, food and household appliances, for example. And other sectors have returned to low levels, even levels lower than before the pandemic. Pharmaceutical products and personal care products like watches or jewelry. One more example, going into disaggregate level here. Sorry about low font, but we deal with 34 three-digit sectors. But the example I wanted to make that kind of helps you to think in terms of, for example, supply chain disruptions as the source of inflationary pressures, and these data on shortages. If you look inside food, and we distinguish unprocessed food. If you look at unprocessed food, stockouts have returned to low levels. So here examples are, fruits, vegetables, eggs. If you compare it to processed food, so same broad category food, but we distinguishing processed and unprocessed. For processed, for most of them, like canned food, stockouts have remained high. And of course, the difference here is that processed food probably they have deeper supply chains than unprocessed food, and so that could potentially explain why is it that processed food shortages are more prevalent today relative to unprocessed food. So just to summarize this part of the analysis, just showing you the dynamics of stockouts in the data. There's sort of three regularities in the data. First is the stockouts spiked early in the pandemic and have remained high since then. There's been a compositional change in the types of stockouts that are out there, where temporary stockouts have been going down, whereas what we call permanent stockouts, the net number of discontinued products have been increasing ever since. And finally, over time, some sectors have recovered in terms of the shortages issues, whereas others have not. Now, in the second part of the analysis, we want to look at whether these data can be associated with inflation observed across these sectors and countries. So just to show you again inflation data, if you look at official CPI indices in these 7 countries, it's been going up in the last year or so. Now, just to make a point that sometimes people ask, well, these are kind of billion prices project data scraped online, maybe they're not very representative of sort of inflation indices used, in official statistics. And you can see here, these are these indices constructed from these online scraped price data, and you can see that they're quite representative. So just a few basic correlations here using US example. The question is, whether sectors that experienced more stockouts, whether you see that inflation has also been elevated there. So one example is food and beverages, where I've shown you that shortages have been high over this time. And the graph here, it's a scatter plot. So on the x-axis is the inflation rate, on the y-axis is the rate of temporary stockouts, and you can see that there's a positive association there. When you go one sort of level or the segregation deeper, each point here is observation for a 2-digit sector for its inflation, monthly inflation, and temporary stockout rate. You also see that there's a positive relationship. But
Oleksiy,
yes,
Oleksiy, what's your notion of inflation when I can't get products?
So these are inflation for observed products, not those that stocked out, and it's consistent with practice of statistical agencies that have to deal with these kind of issues, right? They survey prices from the shelves, like the BLS does, for example, for the US, and if suddenly the person who is collecting the price for BLS comes back and tries to find the same product that they've been tracking for price collection, they find that it's not there, maybe temporarily. What do they do to measure prices correctly? And sometimes they just impute the price for the product that is unavailable by using price behavior for its close substitutes. So this is the similar idea here, is that even though the stocked out products are not here, the inflation behavior of very similar products are probably representative of how prices would behave had these products not stocked out. Okay.
So Oleksiy, can I ask a related question? So are you going to show us
Yeah.
stuff where you look at like stockouts today versus inflation a month before or something like that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll wait then.
This is actually so exactly, these are contemporaneous kind of correlations, right? You're not going to find much of a strong relationship here if we correlate monthly inflation with contemporaneous out of stock. You find some positive correlations significant, but they are weak, and for some sectors they have opposite sign. Now, if you look at sort of more not monthly inflation, but sort of annual inflation, if you smooth things out, there is sort of more firm relationship, and it's kind of makes more sense because it says that sectors that experience more shortages issues, they also tend to have closer link to inflation, annual inflation. But nonetheless, this seems to be quite sort of tenuous, fragile evidence. And part of the reason is, of course, that the relationship between stockouts and inflation is probably not sort of this static, right? That you need to look at the dynamic relationship, and that's what I'm going to do in the next slide. But just to say here that even these magnitudes are not negligible. So to interpret these coefficients, they're consistent with a number like if a stockout rate goes up from 10% to 30%, which is not unusual for this time, then the year-on-year inflation would be up by 0.5% for the US. So these are not negligible magnitudes. Okay. So going to more dynamic estimation here. Here's what we're going to do. So we're going to estimate the dynamic response of inflation to a stockout disturbance at the most disaggregate level that we have, which is at the 3-digit sector level. And in this exercise, we're going to treat that these shocks that we're going to define for stockouts as completely exogenous. Okay. We're going to define the shock by estimating for each sector's out of stock rate an AR1 process. So stockout rate in a sector J is going to depend on its past week's stockout rate plus the idiosyncratic term, and this is what we're going to call the stockout shock. Then we want to estimate how inflation in a sector responds to this disturbance, to stockout, and we're going to use the linear projections method from Jordan to estimate this impulse response. This is a standard sort of way of doing linear projections. Left-hand side is the change in the dependent variable, which here is either sector inflation rate or sector stockout rate, okay, relative to what it was prior to the shock. In response to these series of these stockout shocks, there are other terms, so controlling for the lag of the dependent variable, and there are sector fixed effects here. When you estimate this form, then these coefficients, so each shock with a timestamp certain lags ago, will give you the impulse response at a certain horizon after the shock. So this estimated coefficients beta give you basically the shape of the estimated impulse response. So how does it look here?
Sorry.
So this is yes.
So I thought Kim's question was a bit of going in the reverse direction. So going more from, so before you see the stockouts, you're going to see price changes. Like, maybe prices are going up and then at some point you just run out of stuff. So here taking the reverse view, or.
Yeah, so here, for now, we say if there's a, so the idea here is the following: if there's some kind of supply disruption, cost disturbance to this seller retailer, then it immediately creates, the shortage, the inability of this seller to offer the product online. Okay, so we consider this as something that comes first here. Of course, what happens to the price will have an effect on the stockout, and this is something we're going to cover in the third part of the analysis that I'll show you right after this. So this endogeneity, endogenous relationship between prices and stockout is something I'm going to cover next. Right now, let's just look, if stockouts were something that is just hit you, what do you see is going to happen with inflation? The other reason why we want to focus on this is because we kind of want to know if there are shortages observed for retailers. What do you expect to see for the price certain time after? So we're kind of interested in this sequence, even though the reverse sequence, as Kim said, is still relevant. But I'm going to cover it a little bit later. Let's do it step by step. Okay, so treating stockout disturbances defined this way as exogenous, and estimating the dynamic response of inflation after that. Here's what we get. So the shock here is a 1 standard deviation increase in the rate of all stockouts. Okay, for a 3-digit US sector. The estimated response says that there's going to be a significant response of inflation that peaks at around 1.5 months or so after, and the whole response lasts about 3 months. Okay, so this estimation shows that there is a significant relationship between stockouts and following inflation, and that it's not negligent because these estimated coefficients imply the following magnitude. So the 1 standard deviation shock to shortages is about 5% rate. So that means that if the stockouts increase from say 10 to 20%, again representative of the historical data, you would see, this response says that you would see monthly inflation go up about within the 2 months by 0.1 percentage point. And 0.1 percentage point for monthly inflation is not that small, right? In annualized terms, it's about slightly more than 1%. So these are substantial magnitudes, okay? So this is what you get from this kind of naive estimation that treats stockouts as exogenous. Through the lens of this estimation, there is a relationship that is significant and economically significant as well, statistically and economically. Okay, so what about this idea that stockouts are not exogenous, that they're affected by some kind of costs on one hand, but also they depend on the decision of this retailer what to do with the price. For example, the idea is that if your costs go up and it's harder for you to continue to supply products online, what you could do is you could raise your price, which would curb the demand, and so there would be less. It would be less likely that you would run out of your stock. So that's basically the idea behind your comments, and this is what we're going to address next. Okay, so the challenge though is that we don't have data on the cost of producing or generally replacing products that are out of stock. So we have to rely on some kind of formal framework here. We're going to build on the model in My People with Virgiliu 2015. It's based on a model of a monopolistic firm that has the technology to store products, so it accumulates inventories. And it accumulates inventories because it's incentivized to avoid stockouts. First, because stockouts are costly. If you stock out of the product, you wish you could have continued to sell your product. So you kind of want to avoid that. Of course, inventories help also the firm to smooth variations in the cost, right? So if the costs are high, you prefer not to order at this time and rather sell your products out of stock. So there's two motives here for a firm to accumulate and keep inventories. The idea is the following. So the firm, there's going to be first order condition, which basically makes a prediction for how the firm's price, cost, and stockouts are related. Okay, we're going to use this first order condition, aggregate it to a level of a sector. Okay, and estimate that sector relationship using weekly data that we have, which is out of stock, a fraction of out of stock, and the inflation indices for a sector. And so we're going to use that model to look at what happens if, instead of this exogenous stockout shock, what happens instead if there's a cost shock? How do stockouts and prices respond? So that's the idea here. Let me cover the model quickly. So it's a model of a sector of monopolistically competitive firms, I. The sector is J. Each sector makes orders for the products that it sells. These orders are Q, J, T, I. And it obtains these orders from a supplier at the price P sub I. And it has technology for converting these products into the specific variety, its specific variety I. Okay. So therefore, this firm is accumulating inventory stock that will be available for sale. So that stock is called Z. And you get it from carrying over the stock from the previous period. So that's the stock you have at the beginning of the period, Z0, plus what you ordered, which is Q. In addition to deciding how much of stock this firm wants to have this period, Z, the firm also needs to decide what price to set because it has some monopoly power. It sets its price PJTI. The firm is subject to a demand system here. It's a usual demand that can be derived from constant elasticity assumption on preferences. So it's a function of this firm's price that it needs to set relative to the sector price and relative to the aggregate demand from products in this sector. It also depends on V, which is the idiosyncratic IAD shock to the demand for this firm. I don't put any indices here because it's just an IAD shock. It's drawn from some CDF. Okay, so this firm has to choose two things, price and stock, before it learns this realization of this idiosyncratic demand shock V. So because of this timing assumption, the firm really will care about the expected revenue from selling this product. So the firm will end up either stocking out, so it will sell all of its stock Z, or if it doesn't stock out, it will sell all products demanded. So minimum is either or. You either sell all you have or you sell what's demanded. You don't stock out. And expected sales means that you take integral over all possible realizations of this shock.
Oleksiy, I have a quick question about these
Yes.
demand shocks. I know I'm familiar with how they worked in your other paper, but I'm wondering if there's a way that you guys could use these to be able to say something about the relative contributions of increased, just kind of increased demand in general versus actual, supply chain related costs to what's driving what's going on now. And that lots of people are saying that, all this fiscal expansion has really boosted demand for, some products. COVID reduced demand for some other products just because, you had no reason to buy them. It could be as simple as just saying that these Vs are correlated across firms within an industry or something like that. I wonder if you guys, I'm sure you don't have anything to say about that right now, but I would be curious to know whether it would be possible to use this kind of framework to sort out those two margins.
Yeah, actually, so initially we were hoping that that's what we will end up doing because,
Okay.
right? Because, because to the extent that, well, this model will predict that, under certain assumptions about, these shocks versus whatever supply factors fundamentals you may have, the model can make predictions that will enable a econometrician to make statements about which of the forces is driving the data. But there's a few difficulties here, and as you said, we're not going in there. The difficulties are, first of all, as you can see, the assumption about this V shock here is IID. It's not even persistent over time for this firm, and it's done for tractability. It gives us
Right.
sort of a very convenient form that you will see. You can extend these shocks to kind of more general serial correlated shocks, but then you will end up in a more kind of numerical type of analysis, which also not easy to deal with, especially if you have to at the end try to distinguish between these shocks driving the data versus supply shocks. So we that's exactly where we wanted to go at first. And I was telling George earlier that we actually had we developed a general equilibrium model where we had sort of these kind of elements and kind of supply fundamentals. But once you start adding this structure, it's actually maybe surprisingly becomes even more difficult to try to convince readers that the statements you're making about, okay, it's demand, not supply that's driving the data, you run into other problems just because of this additional structure that you're adding to your model. So it's probably, I mean, the framework is there, but it's not easy to think about concretely how we would do that. Very sympathetic to the question.
Okay, no problem. I'm happy to hear your thoughts about it. That's good enough.
Great. Okay, so for this firm, it needs to think, okay, so how much stock do I need to carry, right? And it's either I will stock out or not with certain probability. So there's going to be some kind of threshold size of the shock. If the demand that I will realize is above that threshold, I will stock out. So we know this magnitude of this kind of threshold shock, and the firm controls that threshold by making a choice about how much stock to have, and of course indirectly by making a choice about the price, which price it sets. Now this kind of model is completely compatible with assumptions about, without I almost said the word that I promised I wouldn't say, inflexible prices. So you can add here price adjustment constraints, and kind of if you want to solve also for equations that characterize price adjustments. We don't need to do that here. I'll show you why. But what's important here is that these assumptions, these price constraints, they need to be time dependent, meaning that the choice of the firm how much stock to carry does not affect the timing of price adjustment of the firm. It can affect the magnitude, but not the timing. So this is important for us to be able to use the prediction of this particular model. But other than time-dependent price adjustment, it can be many of the time-dependent price adjustments used, like Calvo. Okay, so let me derive the first order condition of interest here. So the problem of the firm, again, the firm will choose sequences of its prices and stocks. This is the objective function of the firm, so discounted stream of profits. This is the sales revenue, so the firm's price and its sales, minus the cost, which is a product of the price from the supplier, plus the additional term, quadratic term, that conveys that the cost of replacing a product is going to be increasing with the size of the order relative to some kind of average, some kind of constant here. So the firm will maximize this objective subject to conditions in the previous slide, initial stock, and the law of motion for the next period initial stock. So the firm will end up with a certain amount of stock next period after it sells its products from the stock it had available for sale, and on top of that, add depreciation. That's what the firm carries out to the next period.
Oleksiy,
Yes.
it's sort of like a funny restocking function here, right? It's the guy wants to smooth his orders as much as possible, as opposed to like an SS model where you want to kind of smooth, you want to concentrate your orders in a few months as possible. So can you speak at all to like how important this assumption is versus the alternate assumption?
So this assumption is the key actually for what we do here. So if you're not convinced that this assumption is sort of adequate here, then we would be in trouble here. I will say that this assumption here captures production smoothing motives that are quite prevalent in the inventory theoretic literature. So that's first. Second, even if you look at data on inventories and you run model without this kind of term, this model will predict that inventories are too volatile. And the reason it does that is because in these models, the inventory decision is intertemporal, right? The firm is choosing whether to produce extra amount of unit of stock today versus tomorrow. This is intertemporal choice. And that choice is affected a lot by the firms, by the real interest rate, okay? In the data, the sensitivity of inventory investment with respect to the real interest rate empirically have been found pretty low. So terms like this is what's been justified in the literature that would be helping, matching the data on inventory stock. So that's kind of one answer why we put it here. The other answer I'll give you in 2 slides when I'll try to connect with some examples of what it's capturing. Okay. So with this technology assumptions, what the cost of replacing a unit of stock is the product of the price from the supplier plus the term that is linear in orders. Okay, and this is key, as I said, answer to George, because we know that if the firm has low initial stock, it needs to order more. This says that if the firm needs to order more, its unit cost of replacing stock will be higher. In particular, if the firm happened to stock out in the previous period, it means that it will definitely need to order a lot, which means that its stock will be high. And this feature is something we're going to build into our empirical specification in a few slides. So here's the first order condition that you obtain here. The optimal inventory, so this kind of threshold shock size that distinguishes stockouts from not, it's basically the ratio of your stock relative to average sales. Think of it as inventory to sales ratio that is optimal for this firm. And there's sort of a numeric function that characterizes, how this threshold shock level, depends on the stock. The first order condition looks like this, okay? On the left-hand side is the derivative of this function. What you need to know is that that whole thing is the probability of stock out by this firm as a function indirectly of, its stock Z. On the right-hand side is a term that depends on 3 things. The cost of replacing products today, so that's omega, its expected cost tomorrow, and the price of the product today. And here how they depend on each other. So if the firm is facing high cost replacing cost today, okay, it means that it's costly for it to carry stock. So it carries less stock. If it carries less stock, the probability of stockouts will be high. What matters here is not just how high the cost is, but how high it is relative to what you expect cost to be tomorrow. So if the cost tomorrow is expected to be lower than the cost today, you get the same thing. You look at tomorrow, that tomorrow I have my costs lower. So I don't want to produce, pay for my stock today. I prefer to do it tomorrow. And so I'll end up with low inventory today, high probability of stock out today. And finally, the price of the product also matters here a lot, obviously, because if I have higher price, then it means that the revenue that I get from selling the product out of my stock will be higher. So if I offer higher price, I want to have more stock ready to be sold. If I have more stock to be ready to be sold, it means that my probability of stockouts will be low. So if the price is high, inventories are high, probability of stockouts is low. Now notice an important for our data, important property of this first order condition. The left-hand side is the probability of stockout, or if you look across many firms, it will be related to the number of stockouts, fraction of stockouts observed across a big population of firms. So if in the data you observe the incidence of stockouts across many firms, you don't need to know how these stockouts are associated with the stocks, right? So if we directly observe the stockouts, so we don't need to know anything about this threshold, about demand, about theta, or even about the distribution of idiosyncratic shocks, because the predicted relationship here gives us stockouts right away. Okay, so as I told you, the idea is take this cursor condition, this is for each firm, aggregate it across all firms I in this sector, and derive relationship between number of stockouts in the sector, price in the sector, and cost in the sector. This is how that sector specific relationship looks like after we aggregate the first order condition. So we also express nominal variables here in real terms relative to the price level across all sectors. So this is a relative price in the sector J. OS is the fraction of stockouts in this sector. Now, there's going to be also a term that depends on the covariance across section between level of stockouts and price level, just to take into account that maybe firms with lower average price tend to stock out more. It turns out to be not very important, this covariance term. And the right-hand side depends on omega, which is the real replacement cost, and the discounted future real replacement cost here. And there's other things here like depreciation rate and the discount factor. That's why the nominal interest rate here, and 1 minus OS is 1 minus the fraction of stockouts. So we're almost ready to take this to the data, and I'll try to speed up here a little bit. Except that we still don't have the real replacement cost here. So here's what we do. We're going to assume a process for the real replacement cost that is motivated by the model. If you remember, I told you that the key property of the model is that under the assumption of this quadratic cost term, the higher the order, the higher is the cost of replacing. So we know that if there are more stockouts in the sector at large, then the sector-specific replacement cost will be higher. That's according to the model, and that's the feature we're going to build in to this assumed process for the real replacement cost. It's just simply a linear function of the number of stockouts in this sector plus the additional error term. Now, just to give you examples of what's the idea here, why is it that if the firm last week experienced some kind of shortages issues that led it to stock out, why is it that it would face higher cost today? The idea is that, and you see this a lot sort of in policy fora and media and so on today. So here's a few examples. So if you face shortages issue, what do you do as a retailer? You look ahead, you buy extra inventory, something you wouldn't do before. So that might imply higher unit costs. Or you spend more time trying to, tracking down your vendors, or if the vendor drop, you find another vendor. That's a costly activity. You do something with trucks. Maybe instead of sending the truck to your supplier, you send the truck directly to manufacturer. Figure out how to substitute those products that you stocked out. There are other indirect strategies that have to do with your price decisions. Like, for example, you can reduce number of discounts to keep your prices higher. Okay, so those are the examples of why this is not maybe a crazy idea. Okay, so once we have this, we just plug back in this, instead of replacement cost, we plug this form. And so we end up with the function, nonlinear function, that has inside sector price, out of stock today and last week. There's covariance term, there's nominal interest rate inflation, there's coefficient from this slow motion, and depreciation rate. And the shock there in this relationship is the shock term in this assumed rule of motion for the shock. So If we can estimate this relationship using the data for all of the variables here, then we can back out the coefficient in this rule of motion and the realized cost dictated by the data. So that's the idea. So I mean, we use normal set of instruments, so lag dependent variables, and some controls that tell us the state of the health crisis, as well as some indicators of operational challenges and stringency indices. I'm happy to tell more about them later on. We use the weekly data and the data that I've showed you. This is just a report on the quality of the fit of this model. The estimated coefficients are very highly significant, and they imply a very sort of meaningful economically relationship between a disturbance in the stockout rate and the response of the cost. Okay, let me just show you let me tell you two things before I conclude. So one is, notice that the model predicts that conditional on the cost, the out of stock probability by the firm and its price are conditionally negatively correlated. So another way to say this is, if I'm facing high cost, I can do one of two things that are substitutable. I can either raise my price, which means that my stockout probability will be lower, or I can let the price stay low, but that means that I'll have to face higher stockout. So the model predicts that they're negatively conditionally correlated, which means that through the lens of this model, if in the data you see that both prices and stockouts are high, and the model says that, well, they're supposed to be negatively related, then the model will interpret observation when both stockouts and inflation is high, that the costs are high as well. And one example you can see here, if you compare the experience over the pandemic for household products versus other goods, the stockouts rate was about 5% in household and 4.6 in other goods, which is similar, okay? But inflation over that time was very different. Prices were higher for household products, but they went down for other products, other goods, personal care goods. And so even though the shortages seem to be at the same level, the model would produce the result that the cost implied by joint behavior of prices and stockout says that costs have increased for household products, but for other goods, it has gone down, okay? The experience of food and beverages just shows that, temporary stockouts went down, permanent stockouts went up. So depending on which of the two stockout measures you use, you're gonna end up with different estimation for the underlying cost. Okay, so this is the last figure before I conclude. This is the same estimation, similar estimation that I've showed you when the shock is the impulse to the stockout rate. Here, this is the response to the cost shock that we estimate. And this is the response of inflation rate, okay? If you remember before, the response of inflation rate in sort of more reduced form exercise was that it didn't respond at the beginning and then it went up gradually and gradually went down. So here the difference is that in response to cost shock that makes stockouts go up, you have that inflation response comes about faster, it's somewhat higher, and it's also more transient, okay? Before it never undershot, now it undershot, meaning that the price level after going up initially kind of levels off shortly after. There are two sort of effects that explain this impulse response. One is the static effect, right? So as I told you, in the data, stockouts and prices are negatively correlated. So if you ignore this by doing estimation that I showed you in the first round, you will interpret that interpret that in response to stockouts, prices are just slow to rise, whereas they were slow to rise because stockouts were high. So once you incorporate that, you will get that in response to cost shocks, inflation is actually more response quicker and higher. The dynamic effect also makes a difference here, that in the model, there's this dynamic relationship that if there's a stockout today, it implies that your costs are going to be higher tomorrow, right? And so if costs are higher tomorrow, if you ignore that, you're going to interpret that, inflation persists longer in response to the cost shock. But once you incorporate that, then you would get that estimated response to a cost shock is actually shorter lived. And so in the first round, the inflationary effect was temporary. Here, once we address the endogeneity of stockout, it's even more temporary. So let me conclude. So we look at the micro data on product availability, and we show that there's been a widespread increase in shortages during the pandemic. And ever since then, there have been important compositional changes in that behavior. One is that more and more discontinued products are dominating the shortages data. And two is that shortages are concentrated on some sectors and less others. And it's these sectors and these countries that are experiencing shortages issue tend to have inflation as well. And we show that whether we use a naive estimation or we use estimation based on the model, we show that there is a link between stockouts and inflation. But inflationary effects seem to be disappearing after a few months. So the main takeaway that I want to leave you with is that based on this analysis of historical data, we just do not find the link between stockouts and inflation persisting. Of course, that could be just because the data is relatively short. And so the takeaway, sort of thinking forward, addressing the question that I've mentioned at the beginning, okay, so everyone wants to know whether high inflation is going to stay or not. That, according to our analysis, that depends on what happens with the costs and supply disruptions, everything that underlines this pressures that create the shortages in the first place. If these problems persist, it's more likely that you will see inflation staying up. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Oleksiy. So now we'll just open the floor for questions and discussions. If you have something to say or a question, just go ahead and unmute and hop in. So, and actually, I'll go first, I guess, since I'm already unmuted. So can you say a bit more then about, how you ended talking about the persistence of inflation? So I know you and George made a pact not to talk about sticky prices, but if prices were downwardly rigid, isn't that what Fed people kind of like to think about? Would that change kind of the way things pop out of here? I mean, is your model basically like once the shortages go away, you'd expect prices to drift back down, or how does that work?
So you can see a little bit even in these types of responses that at the beginning, I don't have a response of stockouts, but if I plotted to you, stockouts are high right away and then they gradually go down. So if you compare response of stockouts to response of prices are always kind of take time to respond. Okay, and one idea why is because of the inflexibility of prices. Okay, so there is this kind of sluggishness that you see even in our estimation that will matter somewhat here, right? It matters because it means that even if there's a cost shock right away, but we know that it will take time for prices to respond to the initial shock because of price adjustment constraints. It means that this makes stockouts more volatile, right? So the price inflexibility makes stockouts more volatile because, again, as a retailer, I suddenly realized that my supplier is not there. So suddenly the cost of me replacing a product that I sold out, I'm running low on the stock. What do? I would like to increase my price, which would curb the demand, and I kind of hold to my stock a little bit longer. But if I'm constrained in terms of hiking my price because of price inflexibility, I will end up having to stock out more likely, right? So the main implication here is that inflexible prices mean that stockouts are probably gonna be more volatile. I'll give you one more example. Looking at cross countries, some evidence that we saw. We look at Canada, for example. What we saw is in Canada, this response was higher, right? So the interpretation was the following: if in Canada, for some reason, retailers are more willing to respond to cost and cost disturbances by raising their prices sooner than US retailers, then that would mean that response of stockouts, they have to incur less stockouts than in the US. So as I said, for a firm, you can manage the response of stockouts and prices as substitutes, right? You can either hike prices and live with lower stockouts, or if you cannot move prices or do not want to move your prices, then it means that you will end up having higher stockouts. And so some evidence from across countries shows that maybe in Canada, retailers are less willing to tolerate stockouts, or maybe they have more flexible prices. But it seems that because inflation, according to our estimates, responds higher than in the US, you see that the inflation responds higher, stockouts respond less than in the US.
Okay.
So, Oleksiy, I guess the first comment is there's a really funny notion of inflation here. I mean, the CPI is supposed to measure the cost of getting goods and services. And if I show up at the store and there's nothing on the shelves, that doesn't really show up in the CPI, but in a welfare-based price index, it would show up as prices are higher. So what this sort of tells me is like we're kind of looking at the wrong prices, or the CPI is not a good measure of the cost of getting goods. This happens like whenever you have like a big devaluation and products disappear. The statistical agencies kind of like carry prices along using old prices, and it sort of makes it look like prices don't change. So that's just one comment. The other comment was just like in terms of like the impulse here, like what's driving all the stockouts. That was a demand shock, right? But you didn't really kind of talk about like this persistent demand shock that led everyone to kind of like stock up. Is there any sense where like these impulse responses would look really, really different if we think about these as just like a demand shock that, everyone showed up and wanted to like get everything?
Yeah, we haven't done the model with persistent demand shocks. It would probably so I don't know what would happen in a model like this. So this is a very fair question.
And I think with your adjustment cost, it's going to work the same, right? Like everyone shows up, they buy a lot. Now my inventories are low. I've got to restock. The marginal cost of restocking has gone way up. And so prices are going to go up temporarily, right? But it's a little bit different. Then the question is, how do you then loop it back into why do we see all these products disappear, right? And that seems like not only do you have like this demand shock that leads to these dynamics, but it also means that like there's kind of a lot of heterogeneity in like the cost response to that demand shock, right? So it'd be interesting to think a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, one thing I'll say to that, one other thing I'll say to that is so we don't the cost that we estimate. This is the first order condition. So you can think of many fundamentals either coming from some kind of common aggregate demand shocks or some kind of technology shocks that move around your cost. We don't go there, right? We don't go into if this is a replacement cost that affects your decision of this firm to how much inventories to have or what price to have. You just take that cost. That's the relevant cost, right? Whether you face higher costs because you need to satisfy higher demand, or because it's just the cost of bringing goods from your supplier, the empirical estimation does not go there. It just sort of it just gives you the cost that these retailers must be facing through the lens of this model. So in this sense, we can say, look, maybe the cost early on that the model would predict, maybe they were high just because everyone was in the store and buying these products. And you had to face, higher orders. So the costs were high during this panic buying. And later, maybe it's a different story why the costs were high, just because suddenly your suppliers are not coming back, right? So in this model, there's no difference really, right? Because it just spits out the cost that is relevant for you. That's the cost of replacing the product. Why you want to replace the product? Is it because demand was high some time back, or is it the cost of supplying goods? There's no way of separating the two here.
Right. I mean,
does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I guess the thing just to kind of complete the circle was, you showed us what happens with stockouts, but then you split up between permanent and temporary stockouts, right? And the permanent stockout, your model doesn't have any permanent stockouts, right? In the sense that as soon as I get an opportunity with this function with CES and like the the cost reorder cost, like guys, as soon as they stock out, they just reorder. And so if you had something that was like a non-CES demand curve where there's like choke point, then you'd have a bunch of firms who are not on their first order condition. They're at a corner. And you would be able to capture like that people don't come back in. And that's probably related to some of the stuff we talked about before, which is, firms are kind of consolidating, they're rationalizing their production line. They're just going to just because they don't have any workers in this period. And so that might be like another way of kind of thinking about the way that the world evolves after the first shock, right? Which is, supply is low, demand remains high. People are going to, focus on like a limited set of products. And so kind of dispersion in costs is going up, and that's choking out a bunch of products. So just a suggestion, if you wanted to kind of get back to the other part of the evidence.
Yeah, no, this is very fair. One thing I'll say is that, in the model, there's only one type of stockouts, right? But the quadratic component in the cost technology, right? It implies it creates this dynamic link that if you experience stockouts in the past, it means that the unit cost of replacing today will be high. Of course, if the costs are high today, you economize in your inventories, which means that even today you're going to face higher stockouts. So you see the past stockouts are going to be correlated with the current stockouts through this link. So maybe this is one way to think about persistence in stockouts. But again, there's no way of distinguishing in the model between temporary and permanent stockouts. I agree that in the model, the model it does not distinguish in any serious way between temporary and this discontinued product. So this is something we can more carefully think in the future. Just to get back to your first question, George. So I absolutely agree. So the index, the price data that are used here are constructed according to official methodology, right? Which is based on available prices. And absolutely, if this is not a proper, price index, because, if consumers prefer to buy this product over close substitute, if that product is not available, it means that there's a welfare loss associated with that consumer having to find a different product, even a close substitute. And that's the idea that you described. One other way to kind of illustrate it is to think of Stockout as an infinite price for a product, right? Even if it was your most favorite brand, if suddenly the price is infinite, you would just never buy it. So then, if you include these infinite prices and reconstruct the price index using the same official methodology, you would get a different price index. So that would be a proper price index. And yeah, it would be, it's something we can do with the help of the model, because the model tells us if you have observations on the sort of fraction of products that stock out and observations that don't, and their price level, what's the proper price index that we can compare the difference between the two. And you already know what the difference will be, right? The
Yeah.
higher stockouts will mean that the proper index is gonna be higher than the official index.
Yeah, you would have like a shadow inflation rate, basically. Just
Yeah.
like the way they computed the shadow interest rate when it was at the zero lower bound, you would have like this shadow inflation rate, and it surely would be higher than what we're seeing.
Yeah, even in a more straightforward way, you could apply like the Feenstra's correction to this. Right? You just, it's based on the share of the goods that disappear, their consumption share before they disappear, and then an elasticity. You could do that right from the data.
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Just requires a CES, kind of price index assumption.
Oleksiy, I have a couple clarifying questions and then one slightly bigger picture question. So one of the clarifying questions was the thing you said right at the end, that, this stockout thing is just a temporary effect on inflation. But I think you said that to the extent, it is playing a role in the persistence of inflation, it would have to be because there are this continuous sequence of stockout shocks. And so I just want to see if that's what you're saying, if I heard that correctly. And then the second clarifying question is on the model. You said, when the firm is optimizing, you'd have this negative relationship between the price and the stockout probability. And so to the extent you actually see in the data a positive relation between them, then it's got to be that costs have changed. I mean, that's the way you would interpret it through the lens of the model. So I just want to clarify that. And then the bigger picture question is, now we're hearing with a lot of these shortages or, through these supply chains. So I was just thinking, like, if you extended your model to have like layers of production, not just one intermediate goods, but the intermediate goods themselves are made from another set of intermediate goods. And I mean, at least in the news, you hear that there are all these, wholesale, or not wholesale, but upstream delays and shortages and such. And so, in terms of like the CPI and stuff, I guess what I'm wondering is the retail, I mean, all that matters at the end of the day is the retail thing. So is like the retail thing just a sufficient statistic for all the stockouts and shortages that are occurring upstream? Or is there something going on where, like, these retailers see that the upstream, they see these shortages upstream, so they know something's going to be happening soon. So then they're endogenously adjusting their prices now, even though the inventories might be high now, and maybe that will affect the nature of the relationship between the inventories, the stocks and these prices. So I don't know, I've said that in a very fuzzy way, but anyway, those are the three questions.
Yeah. So I'll use the answer to the third question as a partially the answer to the first question. So your first question was, okay, so your takeaway, right? So if you look at historical data and you do all these regressions of stockouts, of inflation on stockouts, you don't find that, after a few months, if there was a blip in stockout measured directly or through some kind of model that gives you the cost and then stockout go up and then inflation, we just don't see that there's going to be kind of residual persisting inflation spike conditional on those shocks. So then from that point of view, how do we make sense of ongoing data? So our interpretation is there's two parts here. One is the results say that if the underlying cost go back, then our analysis predicts that there shouldn't be the inflation also should go back after a couple of months. Okay, so that's the results taken literally. So that's why we say, inflation outlook will depend on what happens with those underlying pressures. If they stay up, then inflation will also stay up until they go down. So that's the simple answer. The more complicated answer is, of course, things are kind of evolving here, right? So maybe for the first couple of years of these kind of pressures, there is some link that plays out within almost contemporaneously within a few months. But of course, you can think of other mechanisms that start kicking in because of the prolonged supply pressures or other mechanisms that would start affecting prices, even if the underlying cost pressures would go down. So one example here is what you gave, which is that, you know, if we think of the sort of production networks, sort of supply chain structure upstream from these downstream sellers, and if you imagine that there's also, you know, it takes time for these disruptions to trickle through down to the downstream seller, then it could be that what we're seeing today from the retailers is only the beginning of what's coming down to them because of the, you know, cost issues upstream, you know, with upstream in the production chain. So those are, you know, one type of mechanism that could lead to the propagation of the costs triggered by the pandemic initially. Other examples not related to supply disruptions, but are related to explaining persistence that would, the sort of endogenous persistence in inflation, is things like, you know, gasoline prices, right? So you can relate some of what's happening with the oil today to, right, most of it probably arguably to the pandemic experience, right? So, and we know that gasoline prices are very influential on consumer prices because a lot of consumers buy gasoline, and you know, their experience with heightened gasoline prices affects their expectations for inflation, and we know that, you know, high inflation expectations eventually show up in high actual inflation. So these are the type of examples that say that even after, so our result is kind of narrow, right? It says if there is some kind of cost pressures, say in the upstream, they lead to cost issues facing these retailers. You can, through the lens of our model, you can interpret that affecting the shortages and prices, okay? And so, but there's more to it, and probably going to be more influential, these other mechanisms, the further we go with these issues. Quickly, to the second question you asked is to clarify sort of joint behavior of prices and out of stock. Again, the model says, let me show you the empirical model, for example. The model says if the cost is high, okay, underlying cost, we don't observe it, then this product will be high, product of sector relative prices and sector stockouts. And if one of them is high, the other one doesn't need to be high, right? So conditional on the cost, they're negatively correlated. So that means that if our estimates, where is the table? If our estimates use the data when both prices and stockouts are high, then even if the out of stock shares will be high, okay, what happens with the price will be influential on what the cost is, right? So you see this example that, you know, both stockouts were high in these two sectors, but only in other goods prices actually went down. So it must be that prices went down, the cost could not have been that high. Why? Because the high stockouts in this sector helped to keep prices low in this sector. That's why the estimated cost doesn't have to be as high to justify these data relative to the data when you observe the same stockouts, but the price is higher.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
So let's stop the recording, actually.